Step 4. The next step in our progression is to hit the sled from a stance and not from the knees. The player should strike the sled from a stance while leaving their feet in place. This is the only time in blocking the Crowther with the shoulder that players are asked not to move their feet. Normally it's a no-no in football not to move the feet, but the main objective of this drill is for players to experience how much power they are capable of generating by striking with the forearm and extending the hips. We're looking for players to explode from a stance while leaving their feet in place. Depending on how big the players are and how much weight is added, the player may strike the sled and push it away, thus falling to the turf. It's perfectly fine for the player's abdomen to sag to the ground after the strike. During this drill, the ankles, knees, and hips should all be fully extended. The player is also striking the pad with the forearm. Don't let the feet flop. This is a drill where the coach might want to stand on the sled to give it more resistance. Frequently in practice, you will see the Crowther being hit while a coach stands on the base pan of the sled. By and large, the only reason a coach should stand on the sled is to provide more resistance. We found that standing on the sled is the worst place to view a player's technique. We believe the best place for the coach to stand is to the back and inside of the practicing player, basically where the camera is situated for these drills. Normally we place heavy sandbags weighing around 40 pounds each on the sled for increased weight. What's proper resistance or weight for the sled? That all depends on factors such as how wet the grass is, how tall the grass is, and of course how big your players are. With large players, we sometimes, in addition to the sandbags, add heavy blocking dummies to the sled. Offensive line players in professional football normally weigh in the area of 280 to 330 pounds. Players of that size and strength need additional resistance on the sled. Determining the weight of the sled is more art than science and is something that the coach should feel by watching his players. High school players won't need as much weight added, if any at all, as professional players. When a player executes this drill properly, their entire body is locked out. With this much resistance on the sled, the player remains suspended in the air and his hips are fully extended. There should be no bubble in the hips. You might discuss with your players who have studied physics that if their hips remain up in the air, they have not converted all of their potential energy into kinetic energy. We want players, as this example demonstrates, to explode through the pad using all of their potential power. Step 5. The next step in our progression is for the players to move one step while striking the pad. A majority of players will step with their inside foot when striking the sled with their inside forearm. Many also take a small hesitation or hitch step, and this is of no great concern. Remember to think hips. This is essentially what we want. The player has taken a short step which creates a Z in the knee. Their head is up, their back is straight, and their hips are fully extended. The player can hold this form for a moment and then the body will naturally drop off. We don't want the front shin to be perpendicular to the ground. If that happens, the player will have to ride up and over their shin. Again, a coach can stand on the sled to give it more resistance. This is good form. The player is on the ball of their front foot, their head is up, and they have a Z in the front knee. Step 6. The next and final progression in this series of drills is to block the sled at full speed. This progression is a culmination of all the previous drills. It's time for the player to line up in a stance and explode through the blocking pad. The player will strike with the forearm, explode with the hips, and use both feet. When blocking the Crowther two-man sled, the player's head should always remain on the outside of the pad. There is no drill where the head is placed inside of the pad. It's a good idea to have your players start each practice by hitting the sled with their left shoulder. Normally, the left shoulder is the weaker hitting side. That way, whatever else happens in practice, you have at least improved the player's weakest side. When the player strikes the sled, the front of the pan should generally be 4 to 6 inches off the ground. Higher than 6 inches and the player is chesting the sled as opposed to hitting it with the shoulder. Think head up and butt down. We want players to hit 8 to 10 inches below the top of the pad. When technique appears perfect, you can always emphasize quicker feet and a lower center of gravity. At some point, this drill can become a conditioning exercise as opposed to a learning and blocking drill. Probably 3 to 4 seconds is generally long enough to drive the sled.
I believe that using the Crowther, and assuming you have a group of 8 plus or minus a couple players in your group, a 15-minute period on the Crowther every day or every practice would be ideal, as opposed to an hour one day and don't come back to it for a week. Much beyond 15 minutes becomes probably a little bit of monotony, becomes a physically exhausting drill. It's probably one of the few drills where you can develop skills, develop fundamentals, and at the same time develop conditioning. But conditioning should not be the point of the sled. If you get beyond the point where the player is reasonably fresh, he will just develop bad habits because he cannot do things correctly when he's exhausted.